My name's Vanessa, and today we will be presenting on confidently presenting your quantitative results chapter. Before we get started, just to make sure everyone can hear me, if someone could just type in the chat, that would be great. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Marissa. So welcome in. We will go ahead and get started. So here at Statistics Solutions, we do provide full service dissertation consulting and editing for graduate students on their PhD dissertations. We help with all of the chapters from chapter 1, where you are writing your introduction, all the way through to chapter 5, where you're presenting the discussion. We also help with topic development and with creating the proposal and defense slides. So if you are someone who thinks that you might benefit from some more one-on-one consulting or just assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We do offer a complimentary 30-minute consultation where you can talk to us about your research and we can work together to identify areas that we can help out. And you'll notice in the chat, we've got Sierra on today. She is going to be posting links when necessary, and she can answer any technical questions, or if any technical issues arise, she'll be able to answer those as well. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll open it up for question and answer related to the content that we go over today. So just to get started, the purpose of the results chapter is going to be the first thing that we discuss today. Then we're going to go into the different components of this chapter, including the introduction, data collection and preparation, demographics and descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, analysis of research questions and hypotheses, summary, and then, like I said, we will do Q&A at the end. In terms of the purpose of the results chapter, this chapter here is where you're going to be presenting the analysis that you've conducted to answer the research questions in your study. We recommend that when you are writing this chapter, you format it in a way that presents the findings for each of your research questions and hypotheses separately, and you include some sort of clear and concise statement that explains the particular result for that research question or hypotheses. In this section, you really want to focus on kind of those facts and figures of the results. So a reminder here that I'm talking about quantitative research methods today. So here's where you're going to be presenting the results of those statistical tests. You'll be reporting test statistics, significant values, indicating whether or not you are rejecting or failing to reject the hypothesis. All of those things are going into this chapter. And then you'll want to interpret what those findings mean in the discussion chapter. So here, kind of stick to those numbers and then save that interpretation for later on. And then we always recommend to students, when you are about to start writing or when you're preparing to begin your chapter, to refer to a template from your school. That's going to help you ensure that you are including the exact format that your reviewers are looking for, and you're also including the correct information or whatever information is required for you to pass this chapter in your dissertation. So if you have access to a template or a checklist through your school, those are a great place to start. If you do not have access to resources like that, you can refer to dissertations online through ProQuest, or you can refer to our website. We do have dissertation templates available to students that are interested. And also this presentation, all of the components that I'll go through today provide a very comprehensive list for what should go into this chapter. So you have a few avenues to identify what information is required, but your school is always going to be the best resource, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones signing off on your work. So you will start off your results chapter in the same way that you've started off each chapter in the dissertation, and that's with an introduction. In this introduction, you are going to want to reorient your reader to the purpose of your study. And you can do that by restating the purpose, and then also restating the research questions or hypotheses. Here, it's important that you are maintaining consistency throughout each chapter of the dissertation. So, by the time they get here, they're on chapter 4. So at this point, they would have seen the research purpose, research questions, and hypotheses a few times. And you just want to make sure that you are restating them verbatim so that there's no confusion as to the direction of your study. So feel free to copy and paste here. It may sound redundant or seem redundant as you're reading through it, but this is going to ensure that there is no ambiguity around what it is that you're studying and what it is that these results will be about. Once you reorient the reader to your study, then you can go on to outline the contents of this results chapter. So provide a preview of what they will be seeing in this chapter coming up. And one way that you can do that is by listing out the subheadings or providing a narrative explanation of the subheadings that they should expect to review in this chapter. Next, you will go on to describe the data collection and preparation procedures that you used for your study. Now here, you have to take into consideration that in chapter 3, you've presented these data collection procedures as well. Now in chapter 3, typically when you write that chapter, you are proposing the data collection plan. So things may have changed from chapter 3 to chapter 4. You may have proposed that you're going to be conducting a paper and pen survey in person at your study location. And then maybe as time went on, you changed your mind or circumstances changed. And instead of doing an in-person survey, you moved to doing a virtual survey where you sent out a link. It's important here that you are noting that change. So you'll want to report back on the data collection procedures that you actually did, as opposed to what you proposed. Now, all schools are a little bit different. Some schools may ask you to go back to chapter 3 and revise it based on the procedures that you actually did. And then some will just ask you to leave chapter 3 the way it was. And then in chapter 4, describe any deviations from your original data collection plan. So again, refer to your school to know which method is best for you. But overall, here you're just going to be summarizing the procedures that took place. An important feature in this section is to discuss the response rate and attrition of your study. So you'll want to explain how many total responses you received, any exclusions of the data that you may have had to do. So for example, if you received 300 responses, but 50 of those responses were from individuals who didn't meet the inclusion criteria for your study. You wouldn't want to move those 50 responses forward to analysis because they aren't going to be appropriate to answer your research question, and they should not be included. So you'll want to describe if you had to remove any responses. If you did, how many did you remove? Why did you remove them? And that's going to guide the reader to understand what your total final sample was. So how many people or how many observations were included in that final analysis. You'll also want to discuss that sample size. So in your quantitative study, you most likely conducted some sort of power analysis or something to indicate to you how many responses were needed to sufficiently power your study. If you were not able to meet that intended sample size, here in this data collection and preparation section, you may want to talk about a post hoc power analysis that you conducted if you weren't able to meet that sample size. And then once you do that, you will want to talk about any preliminary data preparation steps that you took before the analysis. So that may be things like checking the data for accuracy. So for example, if you did a paper and pen survey where you had participants hand you worksheets where they completed the instruments for your survey, you may have had to input that information into Excel or into some sort of word processing to prepare it for analysis. you should have built in some sort of quality check to ensure that you are transposing the data correctly from the paper to the Excel sheet to the software that you're using to analyze the data. So here is where you're going to talk about those steps that you took. You may want to also talk about how you handled any missing data. So it's not uncommon for participants in a survey to skip questions. Maybe they forget to answer them. Maybe they don't want to answer a specific question. Things like that happen. So you'll want to describe how you're going to be handling that, whether it's, if participants miss a certain amount of questions, you exclude all of their responses, or you take an average score, whatever it is for your particular study, whatever procedure is most appropriate for you. You'll want to talk about how you did that. And you'll also want to talk about any outliers and how you check for outliers. So outliers are responses that deviate from kind of the norm on what you're seeing in your data. So you'll go through the process for identifying those outliers, and I'll talk about that later on. And then lastly, you want to talk about any coding and recoding procedures that you did to prepare this data for analysis. So it could be that you are taking a sum of a number of instruments to come up with a composite score for the variable of interest that you're studying. So for example, if you are studying depression, the Beck Depression Inventory requires you to take, I believe it's a sum of all of the responses. And then if you get like a 0 to 1 or a 1 to 2, your level of depression is different, or the depressive symptoms being observed falls into a different category. So if you're creating any type of computed variables or any type of manipulation of the data to prepare a specific new variable for analysis, you'll also want to talk about that. So the main takeaway here for these preliminary data preparation steps is you just want to be clear about how you are changing the data before you conduct your primary analysis. And you'll also want to provide some explanation for why you are changing that data. So if you're excluding responses, why are you doing it? If you are recoding or manipulating the data or particular variables, why are you doing that? And all of this is to prepare the specific variables that you're getting for the final main outcome analysis. So we will go through a few examples here, and you'll all receive copies of these slides, so you'll be able to review these examples on your own time if you'd like to. But here's an example of how you might write up your data collection results and indicate the sample size. So here we see they have collected an initial total of 485 survey responses. This person says that participants who didn't complete larger portions of the survey, and here they're defining those larger portions as they didn't complete more than 50% of the questions that pertain to the study variables. These people were removed. So maybe the study was focusing on depression, and this person just didn't answer 50% of the questions related to depression. So because of that, they were removed, and that reduced the sample size from 485 to 396 that were included in the analysis. So here's just an example of how you might convey this information. Here is another example with a little more detail. So here we're including not only the exclusion of missing responses, but also the exclusion of people who didn't meet the inclusion criteria. So let's go through this here. So they tell you how long their data collection took place. In this case, they were collecting data from May 26, 2017 to June 18th, 2017. In the time that they collected the data, there were 163 participants who accessed the survey. Here now we're getting into the inclusion criteria for the study. So 3 people did not agree, did not provide informed consent to take the survey. There was 59 people who left 10% of the questions unanswered. 3 of them had no active work experience. So I'd imagine that for this study, having active work experience as a nurse was part of the inclusion criteria. And so after excluding the people who did not agree to consent and did not have that work experience, and also who had those missing responses, we ended up with a total final sample of 98. So again, this is just a very step-by-step way of explaining to the reader who all began to take the survey and who ended up being included in the analysis for this study. Now, in this example, we are discussing a post hoc analysis for a study that did not achieve the intended sample size. So here you see that through this post hoc analysis, we find that there are 3 predictors for this analysis, and we are getting kind of this expected power for the sample size that was included in this particular study. So once you have provided that information about your data collection, you are going to describe the sample that was included in your study. In these quantitative studies, one feature is that you are hoping to generate a study that is representative of the sample of the population that you are studying. So this section here is kind of leading into the results and explaining to the reader, whether or not your sample is representative, and just describing who is responding to these questions, so that we can get an idea of if this sample makes sense, if they are a good representation of those people. So to do that, you'll start off by presenting the descriptive statistics for any demographic variables and variables of interest for your study. So when I say demographic variables, I'm referring to different characteristics like race, sex, income, gender identity, kind of all of these things that people might describe themselves with. So in doing this, you are going to present those descriptive statistics. If you are describing categorical variables like gender, ethnicity, income, sex, what else? Maybe depressive symptoms, if it's a variable of interest. So anything where they might fall into a category, then you are going to use frequencies and percentages. If you are providing descriptive statistics for continuous variables, so think of things that can be plotted on a number line: age, GPA, weight, BMI, maybe grade point average. These will be presented through means and standard deviations. In this section, you can also compare the demographic characteristics that you have found in your sample to the population. So you might say, in my sample of teachers, 50% were female, and then relate that back to the general population of teachers. So maybe in the United States, we've observed that 75% of teachers are female. I don't know if that's true, but you kind of get the idea there. So just comparing the sample, so the people that participated in your study, to the general population of people that you are kind of intending to provide inferences on. And then you'll want to provide any reliability coefficients for the measures that you've used. So typically, you are going to be using some sort of survey instrument, and those survey instruments are most likely validated if they've been used before. So I gave that Beck's depression inventory as an example earlier. There are reliability coefficients presented in kind of the foundational papers for that particular inventory. So looking back at the literature to see where your instruments have been used, and just providing reliability information about that instrument here in this section is going to let the reader know what instrument you used in your study, and it's going to ensure and provide information that this instrument is appropriate to use for the particular variable of interest that you are studying. If you're doing a study that is more biological in nature, so maybe you are collecting patient weight, height, BMI, blood pressure, things like that, you can also, in this section, explain the instruments that you use to collect that data. So maybe you used a bioelectrical scale to calculate BMI or heart rate or something. Here you can just talk about that as well and provide any information that explains that that is a validated measure for the variable of interest. So now we'll go through a few examples of how you might present this information. So here we see this person is presenting their demographic characteristics in a table. I think a table is a great way to do this. I think if you start off with this kind of narrative summary of the table and then present the table, it's giving your reader a very clear snapshot of your sample. So I highly recommend tables for this type of information. Here we see that they are presenting frequencies and percents. So we know that they're doing that because they're using categorical data here. So in this case, they're presenting gender, age, and they're also giving some indication of how many missing observations were in these particular categories. So there were 6 people who didn't answer the gender question in this study, and there were 6 who also didn't answer the age question. Now, earlier I mentioned that age could be a continuous variable. I do want to point out here that it's presented in a categorical fashion here. So instead of, having each number by itself, we've got these age ranges. So this is an example of where it would be appropriate to present age as a categorical variable and how you would do that. Do we have any questions on this example before I go on? Okay. All right. So now in this example, we are presenting the continuous demographic variables for a total of 98 participants. So again, you see age. In this case, we're presenting age in years. So it's appropriate here to present it this way. We're providing the minimum, the maximum, the mean, and the standard deviation. And then they're also presenting these 2 other variables. So time working as a mental health nurse in years and the nurse to patient ratio. So this is how you might present your continuous variables. And since you're presenting different statistics based on the variable, I do recommend separating out your continuous and your categorical variables and always having some sort of introductory paragraph that just summarizes the high points. So in this case, you might, in your introductory paragraph, say something like, the mean age of participants was 48.2. On average, they had been working as a mental health nurse for 16.51 years. And there was an average nurse to patient ratio of 14.37. So that's just an example of what you might say. Now here, this is an example of reporting that reliability coefficient for the instruments that are used in this study. So here they are using a few subscales of this, the SCS. So they've got a positive attribute subscale, which includes self-kindness, common humanity, mindfulness, and then a negative attribute scale that includes self-judgment, isolation, and identification. So here they are reporting the number of items in the subscale and then the Cronbach's alpha. So this is just another way that you can present this information. Now, once you've gone through that, so far we have explained our data collection procedures, we've described our sample, we have described our instruments, and now we are going to describe the step just before analysis. So for many statistical tests, there's some sort of or some list of assumptions that need to be met in order to move forward with those tests. So for example, if you want to conduct a t-test, the assumptions for that test are that the data is normal, and that there's homogeneity of variance. So there's different assumptions for each test. In this section, you're going to explain what the assumptions for your tests are, and you're also going to explain how you tested the assumptions and what the results of that assumptions testing was. So were the assumptions met or were they not met? So in this section, first, you will want to say how you tested the assumption. So for example, for the assumption of normality, you might test that by looking at a histogram of the data. You might look at the skewness and kurtosis. You could run a Shapiro-Wilks test. So here you'll explain what you did. Then you'll want to explain what the result of that assumption was. So was the data normal? Was it not normal? If there were outliers, how many were they? Through that, you'll explain if the assumption was met or not. And then you'll want to explain any actions that you're taking if the assumption is not met. So for example, if there were outliers in your data, is it appropriate for you to move forward with the statistical tests? That'll just depend on the test that you're doing. So sometimes it's okay. Sometimes you may need to manipulate the data. So here you'll just say whether or not you're going to move forward or if you're going to change your plan. So for example, some ways that you might change your plan, if you find there's outliers and you need to have normal data, maybe you're going to exclude the outliers. So maybe you just kind of remove those people from your data set. Or maybe you change the type of statistical test you're going to use for your main outcome. So you kind of have some options here, but the most important part of this is that you are justifying the decisions that you're making. And you can do that through citing literature or citing specific studies that have followed the procedures that you have. So a lot of this is really built into the literature. You can kind of use your background knowledge, but there is a clear roadmap on what you should do in each case if you're looking for it. And we do have some resources to those types of topics on our website as well. Okay, and next we will go over some examples. So here, this is an assumptions test of normality. In this case, we're using a PP plot to inspect whether or not the data is normal. You can see that the data follows along the normal line pretty well. So this person concluded that there were no significant deviations from the normal line, and so the assumption of normality is met. Figures are a great way to show that your assumptions are met. So it may be helpful to include figures in your paper to, again, just really hold your reader's hand and show them step by step how you worked in this study. Here's another example. So in this case, we were examining multicollinearity, and the researcher was using the VIF values in their table to identify whether or not the data met multicollinearity. Here they found that there was an outlier. So in this case, they did exclude this outlier to maintain the assumption for their test. So they say this observation was excluded from the analysis, and that's kind of how they move forward. Now, this is the meat and potatoes. So everything we've discussed so far is really just setting your reader up with the context to understand the results of this study. So they're getting the information on what data was collected, who it was collected from, how you prepared the data, and now you can finally say what the answers to your research questions were and whether or not you rejected or failed to reject your hypotheses. So in this section, I recommend you organize it by research question or hypotheses. So if you have 5 research questions, you'll want to present the results for each of them on its own. It can get a little bit confusing if you start to mix and mingle. So I recommend answering research question 1, then moving on to 2, 3, 4, and so on. Again, here you are going to note any changes from your original proposed data analysis procedure. So for example, if your assumptions testing was completely different from what you expected, maybe you had to completely overhaul your data analysis plan, use different statistical tests, or maybe you changed variables completely or whatever it is, here you'll report back on those deviations from your original plan. And then you will clearly identify the variables that were used in your analysis. So you'll want to identify the independent variable, dependent variable, predictors, criterion, and covariates. Next, you'll report the appropriate statistics that were associated with each of the tests. So depending on the test you're using, there may be different statistics that you report. If you were using a t-test, you'll report the test statistic. If you're using an ANOVA test, you'll report the F statistic. So it really just depends on the test that you're doing. And again, we've got a lot of resources to help with this. So if you have questions, we can definitely help out with that. And then you are going to report any post hoc testing if it was needed. So for example, if you did an ANOVA test and you found a significant difference between the levels in your ANOVA, the next step in that process would be to conduct a post hoc test. So in some cases, you will report the findings of a post hoc test, in some you will not. It really, again, just depends on the type of analysis that you are doing. And then, so after you report kind of those nitty gritty numbers, facts and figures for each of the tests, you will want to provide a clear statement answering the research question and explaining what you did with the hypothesis. So if you found a significant result, you'll say something like the results of this test were significant, and so we rejected the null hypothesis. So you'll just want to have all of these pieces on this slide for each research question and hypothesis outlined in your study. So here are a few examples. This is an example of an independent t-test. This t-test was conducted to determine if there were differences between the scores on this instrument, the SAI instrument, based on gender. So we wanted to know if males and females had different mean scores on the SAI inventory, and we wanted to know if the differences were statistically significant. So that's why we're conducting this t-test. So they're identifying their independent and dependent variables. In this case, the independent variable is gender, and the dependent variable is the score on the inventory. And they're providing a clear statement on what the results were. So in this case, the results were not significant. Here, they're providing in APA format the results of the t-test. So we've got our test statistic, which in this case was 1.96. Our degrees of freedom, 105. We have our p-value, 0.052, and our effect size, which was 0.55. So this researcher concluded that there were no differences in SAI score based on gender. And when there are no significant differences, they failed to reject the null hypothesis. They then provide the descriptive statistics relevant to this test. So in this case, we were comparing means. So they provide this information in a table. So here you can see, here were the different means, and we know from our test, our t-test, that they were not statistically different. They were not significantly different in this sample. Here's another example. In this case, the researcher did find a significant difference. So let's go through this one. Here we've got an independent samples t-test. In this case, rather than looking at the differences in scores based on gender, we are looking at the difference in scores based on school level. So we're looking at elementary school level and middle or high school level, but it's the same thing. We want to know if there was a statistically significant difference in the total score on the SAI. So here our independent variable changed. Now it's school level. And our dependent variable remained the same. It's the total score on the SAI. In this case, our results were significant. So our p-value, you'll notice here, is very small. We've got a p-value of 0.002. And then again, they've reported the relevant statistics. So we've got our degrees of freedom, which is 105, our t statistic, 3.15, and the effect size, 0.6. They concluded that there were differences in SAI score based on school level, and then they gave you the relevant statistics again here. So these were the means for each level, and we know that these were statistically different or significantly different, and so we reject the null hypothesis. So this is a bit of kind of like a refresher on your statistics courses, but again, you'll have these slides to refer back to when you're writing this up. Okay, and now in this example, they're presenting the results of an ANOVA test. So they conducted an ANOVA to determine if there were differences in the perceptions of teachers towards professional learning effectiveness. And again, they're measuring this professional learning effectiveness by the SAI. So in the ANOVA, you'll notice we have more levels than the t-test. And in this case, the levels are that teaching experience. So it's perceptions measured by the SAI based on years of teaching experience. So because of that, our independent variable is now years of teaching experience, and our dependent variable is the SAI total score again. So same dependent variable. In this case, they determined that the results of the ANOVA were not significant. So let's review this APA output here. So we have our degrees of freedom. You'll notice for the ANOVA test, it's different. We have an F statistic and we have 2 degrees of freedom. So we've got some differences here. We're reporting the value of the F statistic, so 0.76. We're also reporting our p-value again, 0.555. It's kind of standard that you're looking for a p-value that's less than 0.05. So here their results were not significant because this is greater than 0.05. And this p-value tells us that there were no significant differences in SAI score based on our independent variable here, which was years of teaching experience. Because there's no significant differences, we are going to fail to reject our null hypothesis. And then here again, they're just presenting those descriptive statistics to help the reader really see what were the means, to understand, what here was not significantly different. So we're understanding that although those who had 0 to 4 years of experience had a mean rating of professional learning effectiveness of 4.01, and those who had 15 to 19 years of experience had a rating of 4.34. These are not significantly different based on these levels of experience. If this was significantly different, we would move on to do a post hoc test. Okay, and here's another example. In this case, we are doing a Pearson correlation. So this explanation is a little bit more expanded. Here they're including what the research question was to kind of refresh here. So they're explaining that the research question was to identify or examine the relationships between positive attributes of self-comparison and perceived level of caring efficacy in nurses. And in this case, we are conducting the Pearson's R correlation. So they're clearly identifying the type of test that they're using and why they're using it. So to identify the relationships between these scales or these items. And then they're presenting the relevant statistics. So for Pearson's correlation, we're presenting R. So they give you R is 0.27, and then they're giving the p-value 0.005. And they're giving this for each of the variables. So we've got self-kindness, common humanity, mindfulness, and positive attribute subscale is the kind of overarching thing here. Next, they are giving a statement on whether or not the null hypothesis was rejected. So in this case, there were 2 significant findings. So we see that the variable of self-kindness, the p-value is 0.005, so this is significant. Oh, actually, all of them are, excuse me. Common humanity is significant, mindfulness is significant, positive attribute subscale is also significant. And then in their table, they're indicating the significance with an asterisk. So where you're presenting a large amount of variables, you may want to use an asterisk to kind of guide the reader right to what the significant finding is. Okay. Now, this is another example. In this case, we are looking at a multiple linear regression. So same deal here. We are reporting the relevant statistics. So in the multiple linear regression, you're reporting the F statistic, have our degrees of freedom, the value of the F statistic, the p-value, and R squared. In this case, we know that the p-value is 0.003. So we have rejected the null hypothesis because we have found a significant result. And then we are displaying the table, including all of the variables that were included in the multiple linear regression. And then the relevant statistics from your out point here. So in this case, your significance is represented in this column. So you may want to put an asterisk for the variable that was significant. So here for sex, you may have wanted to add an asterisk here. And again, so that's really the meat and potatoes of this section. Once you have presented all of those findings, you'll want to provide a summary of the chapter, addressing each of your research questions and what the finding for each of those research questions was. And then you will transition to the next chapter. So you might say something like, in the next chapter, the researcher will expand on the interpretation of these findings. So something to let them know what's coming up next. And then just at the end here, one thing I didn't touch on too much is the software that you're using. So there are a number of different statistical softwares or packages that you can use to analyze your data. We do have one here at Statistic Solutions called Intellectus that may be helpful for students working on the dissertation. It's designed for students working on the dissertation, and it conducts the analysis, but also provides this written content. So if I go back to our examples, it gives you this kind of output summary in addition to your tables. So if you're interested in that, reach out and we can talk through those different options for the package. I believe we do offer a free 30-day trial if you're interested in getting some help with that software. But now I will open it up for question and answer. I see that there have been some questions as I've been going through, so we'll go through those. Okay, I see a question. Is there a good online source to help with formatting the results tables for chapter 4? Yes, I believe we have a template on our website. Sierra, if you have a chance to pop that in the chat for Amy. Yeah, I think we have a template on our website. Also any online resources related to APA will be helpful in having that template for your tables. Just make sure you know which version of APA or MLA or whatever version of formatting your school is using, because they differ pretty widely. Okay, I see a question. We give info about instrument in chapter 3 as well. Yes, you do. You do talk about your instrumentation in chapter 3. I think the way it differs in chapter 4 is in chapter 3, you're proposing what your instrumentation will be. And in chapter 4, you're confirming what you actually used. So you may have some differences, because typically when we're proposing our research, it's kind of from the lens of like, okay, if I had an ideal situation, this is what I would do for my study. And things typically change from 3 to 4. So in 4, you're going to be reporting back and giving those bits of information on the reliability of the instrument as well. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Hi, Varnice. Welcome from Mangalore University in India. Thank you for joining us. Haryana, welcome as Jaspreet, welcome as well. Okay, I see that Johannes asked, will we be sharing the materials? Yes, you will be provided with all of these slides and the recording. We also have a webinar archive library on our website that includes all of our webinars. So we do webinars for each of the different chapters in the dissertation. We also do webinars for specific statistical analysis. So check that out if you're looking for more specific content or more content to help you with your paper. Okay, so would like to learn on how to analyze data with SPSS. Are there tutorials on this? Yes, there are tutorials on this. I do not know if we have any on our website, but yeah, I think we probably don't have any on our website specifically walking you through this. But I know that there are definitely many on YouTube. We do also provide walkthroughs. So if you think it would be helpful to meet with someone to go through that, reach out to us using the phone number or email on the slide, and we can help walk you through using SPSS for your particular study. Okay. Some of these results look like they're from survey questions with Likert type scales, which are nominal, not continuous. However, several of the statistical tests used t-tests require continuous dependent variables. Is this not the case? I presented both categorical and continuous data. I'm not sure which one this is referring to, but if it is categorical, then we were giving the means and frequencies in our descriptives. And then if it's continuous, we are presenting, I'm sorry, not means and frequencies, the sample and frequencies. And then if it was continuous, we are presenting the means and standard deviations. But if you want to talk some more about that, we can. Will there be a presentation on qualitative data collection? Yes, Michael, there is, Micah, there are presentations on qualitative data collection. We go through the methodology chapter in qualitative research. We go through the results chapter as well. Those are available on our website. And let's see if I can tell you. I don't have it in front of me when they're upcoming, but Sierra might be able to help with that as well. But yeah, we do have those coming up, and there are past slides on our website if you want to refer back to them. Okay, I see that Anne said, if there are multiple Likert items measuring one factor, can those be summed to create a continuous variable? Yes, absolutely. Again, with this, it's all about kind of the justification. So if that is appropriate to do with the data, or if it's a validated instrument and that's been done before, then you just have to provide some explanation as to why you're doing it. So for example, I talked about the Beck Depression Scale. There's also a patient health questionnaire where patients are asked Likert scale items about depressive symptoms. And then at the end, you take a sum of those responses to come up with a continuous variable of depressive symptoms. So there are ways to do that as well. Okay, I see a question from Teresa. I believe I saw a lengthy description of the findings. Is that typical, or do you just describe the findings in the narrative? I would say it is typical to have a narrative before your table. Yes, I would say it is typical. In testing the assumptions of a statistical test, do you test the assumptions of the dependent variable alone or all the independent variables? Yes, in your assumptions testing, you should be testing your variables alone. Okay. Hello, is the survey, is it the same using the R and SPSS programs to analyze the survey results? Ultimately, you will get the same, if not extremely similar results with rounding. It's just really about which package you feel the most comfortable using. So if you know how to code in R and you can conduct the analysis in R and you're comfortable with it, then yes. If you're more comfortable with SPSS, which is kind of a more point and click method, I'd say it's a little bit easier, then SPSS might be better for you. Personally, I use SAS to conduct all of my analysis, but it really just depends on which coding language or which software language you are most well versed in. Oh, this is a good one. How can I calculate the power of a study if I use secondary data? That is a really good question. We didn't talk too much about secondary data in this presentation today. When it is secondary data, it depends. So if it's data that's been collected by a large organization like the CDC or NHANES or something like that, there's probably already a brief or a report that they have written about that particular data set. So I would refer back to the original work that has been written on that data set to talk about the generalizability of the findings and the representativeness of the sample, as well as whether or not the survey is sufficiently powered. And then actually, since we did have a question about secondary data, a few other areas that we should touch on it. Let's go back here. Yep. So in the data collection section for secondary data, here, since you didn't collect the data yourself, you should be reporting on how you gained access to the data, and also talking about the procedures that the researchers that did collect the data followed. So again, they'll probably have some sort of report. So here you will give information on how many people took the survey based on what they have reported. So again, it's not that you did it yourself, but you're reporting back. So maybe you've got a data set with 30,000 responses, and you are only wanting to look at responses from African-American women living in the Northeast. Then you might explain this survey was administered to 30,000 people. I excluded X amount of participants who didn't meet my inclusion criteria because they were not African-American women and they did not live in the Northeast. So you kind of still do the same thing, explaining those steps to getting your final sample, but it's slightly different because you didn't collect this data. Okay, there's a question. Can you send the template discussed in the Q&A to everyone attending? Let's see. Sierra, if there's a link on the website, would you mind just pulling that down? The link to the dissertation template. And if not, we'll work on getting that information out to you all. Okay, and then Mujadot, I see that you'd like to meet to discuss your dissertation. Absolutely. I'll put my email address in the chat if you want to send me an email. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Okay, I think we've answered all of the questions that we've gotten so far. Oh, just kidding. If you'd like to come up with a predictive model from studying influence on independent variable to dependent variable, what kind of analysis should I use, or what am I supposed to consider in order to choose one? A predictive model. What are you trying? Okay, let's see. Studying influence. What are you trying to predict, if you don't mind me asking? What is the variable that you're trying to predict? Churn. Oh, employee turnover. Okay, thank you. That helps. I think for this, you would want to first, it might be helpful for us to talk more one-on-one because it's very specific to your study. But generally, you'll be wanting to think about the level of measurement of your variable. So how are you defining employee turnover? Is it a continuous variable? Is it a categorical variable? How is that measured? So I think we probably would want to talk more one-on-one to kind of go more in depth on what exactly your study looks like to identify the best analysis for that. Kelly, how long do webinars stay active? They're on our website always, so they'll be there for a long time. I don't think that they expire. And I will give you the link to access that here. Okay, so there's the link to our webinar archive library. And Johannes, I'm going to put my email in the chat for you to see if you would like to meet to talk about that a little bit more. Thank you, Joan. Thanks for joining. Okay, let's see what else we've got. I wanted to turn my main thesis into a journal article. Could you please teach us how to do this, or do you have any classes? We do not have a class at this point on this, but we do help clients move their papers into articles. So if you would like to meet to discuss that, please do reach out to us. We'd be happy to help. We may even have some blog posts, or I can develop a blog post with resources on that. So Nazira, just reach out to me via email and we can talk some more about how you might go about publishing your work. Can I share a link on SPSS? Sure. Please hold. Let me grab a link really quick. 1 second here. Thank you guys for joining. If you don't have any more questions, I hope that we see you soon. And I will be on for a few more minutes answering questions. So if you have them, feel free to stick around. I'm going to grab a link on SPSS for the most recent question. Oh, and if you are interested in the dissertation template, please just put your email in the chat here. And yes, Jenny, all of our webinars are free. So make sure to sign up for our newsletter so that you can be getting information on registering for them. Thanks for joining, everybody. Okay, now let's see who asked me about SPSS. Okay, hi, Johannes. Here, I'm going to put a few things. So we do have an SPSS manual on our website. I just put a link in the chat, but I'm also going to share another one. Just give me a second to pull it up. Okay, let's see. Yep, here is another link to a tutorial, Johannes, from our website. But generally, we do have a lot of information on our website. So I would just log on and just search SPSS because we also have different tutorials for different types of analysis. So I would just refer to that. All right, everybody. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you all for joining us today. I hope that we see you in the next webinar, and definitely don't hesitate to shoot us an email if you have any additional questions related to working on your dissertation. I'm going to go ahead and close out the meeting now. Thank you, Victoria. Okay, my email. That is my email address. Thanks, Johannes. Have a great day.